Hello class, this is Dr. Hardin again, and in this topic we're going to talk about anthropology and how it relates specifically to our course here, a biblical theology of counseling. When we think about the term anthropology, we're actually looking at answering the question, what does it mean to be human? There are many views that are held today, three particular ones I want to talk about, but I think it's important that we understand those views. But it's even more important for our purposes is to understand how those views can affect our counseling. Remember what we've said before is that Christianity offers a comprehensive take on all of life. And the scriptures themselves provide us with the spectacles with which we need to see creation clearly. And so any take we have on anthropology needs to be examined through the lens of Scripture. And so with that being said, I'll kind of explain the three main views of anthropology that Christians hold. Now, these views are somewhat controversial. Not everyone holds to the same thing. We can still fellowship with other individuals that may disagree with us. But I think at the end of the day, at the end of our time of thinking through this, we just have to go back to what doth the Scripture saith. And that being in mind, let me start with the first one. The first one is known as monism. And what monism holds to is that there is not a spirit or a soul as part of the being of the person. You are material. It's a materialistic view, and even some Christians, particularly academics who research and study in the area of neuroscience, they want to reduce everything down into chemical processes. And so that would be a monistic view, or a view of monism. It holds that there isn't really an immaterial part of the self. That is not a predominant view, but it does exist. And so we'll talk about that in a moment as far as where I land on that or how I feel about that. The second primary view, or really popular view, is that of what's called trichotomy. Trichotomy holds that human beings are divided into three parts: body, soul, and spirit. The spirit relates to God. The soul is the seat of the personality. It relates to others. And the body relates to the five senses, if you will. And that has been very popular probably since the turn of the century among Christians. It got a real boost with the Schofield Reference Bible in the early 1900s. And it still is very prominent in some counseling approaches, which is why it's important for us to talk through that. The third major view, which is the one that is held by yours truly. It's also held by the author of your systematic theology textbook. Some others that are noted in this position would be people like John MacArthur also. And historically through the church, it's been held. And that is one of what's called dichotomy, or I think as your author in your textbook puts it, bipartite unity. That's what it is, bipartite unity. In other words, human beings are consistent of two parts: material and immaterial, substances. Those substances interact, but you're not splitting things into three segments or more and trying to figure out who a person is. And the concept, I guess the term might be embodied soul. We'll get into more of why I think that's better in just a moment. But let's go back now to looking at what the implications would be for each of these views. The first view in monism, when we're looking through things scripturally, through the lens of Scripture, what we're seeing here is that there's not a soul. So the question becomes, what happens in the intermediate state between death and the final resurrection? Do you cease to be? What happens? Do you incur soul sleep? Well, the scriptures make it pretty clear that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So I don't think that exegetically a monistic view holds up. I think that it cannot deal adequately with the intermediate state between death and the resurrection. So I would argue that needs to be set aside. Trichotomy. So many people hold that it must be right. Well, like I said, this is one of those things where it's not one of the fundamentals of the faith, but I think that trichotomy really is based on an imposition of Aristotle on the biblical text. It divides things up, and Aristotle had a way of doing this as well. But in this situation, you've got this higher level of spirit. You have a sort of a medium level of soul, and you have a lower level of the body. And that can also lend to Gnosticism in the sense that the body is bad, material things are bad, and need to be done away with, those kind of things. So it can lead to heresies that way. But you look at Jesus, and Jesus says in the book of Matthew, he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of him who can throw your body into hell. Be afraid of him who can throw your body and soul into hell. Well, why did Jesus not say body, soul, and spirit if trichotomy was a necessary way to look at the person? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Why didn't we break it up into heart, mind, soul, and strength? Why just 3? The other thing is individuals that deal with the trifold parsing will tend to assign certain roles to who gets to treat each of those parts. For instance, if you have a spiritual problem, you need to see your pastor. If you have a medical or a body problem, you see your medical doctor. And if you have a soul problem, you go see your psychologist or psychotherapist. Remember, psychology is the study of the soul. And so what ends up happening is, just like we've mentioned before, Schaeffer would say nature eats up grace, but I may put it this way, the secular will tend to eat up the spiritual. The lobby will take over for the attic, and you won't have a holistic view of people, their problems, the prescription to those problems. Once again, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And so I think that the first 2 views I discussed lead to or can lead to an overemphasis on the scientific or the psychological, secular psychological, and not enough on what's really going on with the person, at least in the way we should understand it as Christians. And that's a whole soul problem. There's a reason they call it soul care. It's for the whole soul. And so that also leads me to think, I sit here and I scratch my beard and I think, what did we do for 1,800 years before Freud as a church? Somehow we tended to the spiritual and social and psychosocial needs of our people. And therefore, we need to understand that it needs to be an entire focus on the immaterial part of the man. How do we do that? Well, Ed Welch wrote a book several years ago called Blame It on the Brain. And in that book, Ed has a really good way of parsing things out. And he says, look, when you're looking at some of the disorders you'll encounter, see if you can identify if something is a body issue or a heart issue. If it's a body issue, and the body will not make you sin. If it's a body issue, you seek to strengthen things that can be strengthened, like you identify strengths, improve upon those, build upon them, and you minimize weaknesses. If it's a heart issue, though, we apply the gospel to it. Now, what about someone who has a difficult time controlling their tongue because they have ADHD? That's a nice combination of a mind-body or heart-body issue. We need to talk to them about developing self-control, heart issue. But if there are medical issues going on there where they're really having a hard time controlling themselves because of certain things that are going on in their brain, which is part of their body, we need to consult with a physician and see what needs to be done, be it medication or whatever it might be it diet, whatever. And so, once again, Christianity offers a comprehensive view of soul care. We are not anti-medication. We are not anti-psychology necessarily. But if I'm a monist and do not believe there's a soul, I will spend all of my time simply trying to understand what's going on in the neurological structure of the brain. And that will totally miss ethical and spiritual realities that are there that God calls us to do if we're to function properly. If I'm a trichotomist, I'm going to spend a lot of time focusing on how we relate to God via the Spirit, how we relate to others via the soul, and not really realize that it's a package deal. I hope that my thoughts here have been helpful. Like I said, I don't want to be too dogmatic about any of those three views. It's just that I think that we have to be really careful when we read our theology and understand the Bible, because it has implications for how we counsel, for how we address case conceptualization, and for how we prioritize what needs to be treated. God bless, and I'll talk to you next time.